I stood at the edge of Cedar Ridge, the golden light of the setting sun stretching across the open fields, painting everything in soft hues of amber and rust. The wind carried the familiar scent of earth and dry grass, the sound of distant birds calling to each other, fading into the vastness of the evening. It should have felt like home. It had been my home for years. But as I stood there, gripping the old camera in my hands, I felt like a visitor in my own life, a stranger looking in on something that no longer felt like mine. The weight of the camera was heavier than I remembered, though maybe that had nothing to do with the camera itself. Maybe it was the weight of everything I had left behind, everything I had let slip away. Once, this camera had been an extension of me, something I carried everywhere, something that gave me purpose. I had used it to capture moments that told stories, to see the world in a way that most people didn't. It had been my passion, my escape, my way of understanding the world. But now, it felt like a relic from another life, a life I had traded away for something that, at the time, had seemed more certain, more stable. I looked down at the camera, running my fingers over its worn edges, the small scratches on the lens, each one a reminder of the places it had been, the adventures I had chased, the dreams I had once had. But that was before I had packed up my things, left the city behind, and built a life with Owen here, on this quiet, sprawling land. Before I had convinced myself that security was more important than passion, that a steady life was better than an uncertain one. And for a while, I believed it. I let myself believe that happiness could be found in routine, in stability, in the quiet comfort of knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring. But now, standing here with the camera in my hands, I wasn't so sure anymore. The wind picked up, sweeping strands of my hair across my face, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the cool air settle against my skin. I had spent so long ignoring this feeling, pushing it down, telling myself that it didn't matter, that this was the life I had chosen, and I had to make peace with it. But lately, the feeling had been creeping in more and more, in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, when the weight of all my unspoken thoughts felt heavier than ever. I used to dream so big, used to believe that I could carve out a life doing what I loved, that I could travel, capture the world through my lens, tell stories that mattered. But somewhere along the way, I had let go of that dream. I had traded it for something else, something safer. And I wasn't even sure when it had happened, when I had started to lose myself, piece by piece. Maybe it had been the slow unraveling of time, the way responsibilities had stacked up, the way my dreams had quietly slipped into the background as other things took priority. Or maybe I had let it happen, convinced myself that it was the right thing, that I had to grow up, be practical, settle down. But standing here now, with the sun sinking below the horizon and the camera resting in my hands like a forgotten piece of myself, I felt the weight of all those choices pressing down on me. I opened my eyes and turned, my gaze landing on the barn in the distance, the wooden beams bathed in the last light of the day. Somewhere inside, moonlight, the white mare Owen had brought home last spring, would be waiting, calm and steady as always. And just beyond that, the house I shared with Owen, the life we had built together, the life I had convinced myself was enough. But was it? That question had been growing louder lately, harder to ignore. I loved Owen, I did. He was steady, dependable, the kind of man who always had a plan, who never left room for uncertainty. And for a long time I had thought that was exactly what I needed, someone to ground me, to keep me from floating away into dreams that had no guarantees. But now, I wasn't sure if I was grounded or trapped. I wasn't sure if I had built a life or just settled into one because it was easier than chasing something unknown. I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening around the camera. I had told myself that I had let go of the past, that I had moved on, that the dreams I once had didn't fit into the life I had chosen. But holding this camera, standing on this ridge, feeling the wind against my skin, I realized something. I had never really let go. I had just buried it, tucked it away in the back of my mind, convinced myself that it didn't matter anymore. But it did. It mattered. And the weight of that realization settled deep in my chest. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep telling myself that I was content when deep down, I knew I wasn't. The sun disappeared behind the hills, leaving the sky streaked with deep purples and fiery oranges. The first stars had begun to flicker into existence, tiny pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. And as I stood there, staring out at the vast openness before me, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in a long time. A longing, a restlessness, a pull toward something I couldn't quite name. I didn't have the answers yet. I didn't know what I was going to do, or what this feeling meant, or what it would lead to. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to ask myself the question, what if there was still more waiting for me? What if I wasn't done dreaming after all? I was standing by the barn when I first saw him again, the fading light of the evening stretching long shadows across the ground, the air thick with the scent of earth and hay. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that maybe the past was catching up in the form of a memory, something half forgotten but never fully gone. But then he moved, stepping out from where he had been leaning against one of the wooden posts, and I knew he was real. Jace. The name hit me like a gust of wind, stirring up things inside me that I had long since buried. I hadn't seen him in years, hadn't even allowed myself to think about him too much, because thinking about him meant thinking about everything I had left behind. And yet, here he was, standing in front of me as if no time had passed, as if we weren't standing on opposite sides of choices we had made long ago. His eyes met mine, dark and unreadable, holding something I couldn't quite decipher, something between curiosity and knowing, as if he could already see the thoughts running through my mind. He hadn't changed much, still had that same quiet confidence, the way he carried himself like he was always at ease, even when he wasn't. His hair was a little longer, his jaw a little more defined, but the way he looked at me, the way he tilted his head slightly, as if he was trying to figure me out the way he always used to, that was the same. I swallowed hard, gripping the camera in my hands as if it could anchor me in this moment, keep me from drifting too far into the past. "You're still here," I said before I could stop myself, my voice softer than I intended. He let out a small, amused breath, crossing his arms over his chest. "And you're still avoiding saying my name." The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough that it sent a strange rush through me. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the camera. "I didn't expect to see you," I admitted, because it was easier than responding to what he had just said. He nodded slightly, as if he understood more than I was saying. "Yeah, well, life has a funny way of circling back when you least expect it." His gaze flicked down to the camera in my hands, and something shifted in his expression. Something softer. Something almost nostalgic. "You still take pictures?" I hesitated, glancing down at the worn surface of the camera, at the scratches along the edges that told stories of the places it had been, the life it had once captured. "Not really," I said, and the words felt heavier than I expected. He studied me for a moment, his eyes searching. And I hated how easy it was for him to see through me, how little effort it took for him to find the places where I had been hiding from myself. "That's a shame," he finally said, his voice quieter now. "You were good. More than good." A lump formed in my throat, and I had to look away again, because hearing that from him made something inside me twist. Jace had always been the one who pushed me to be better, to take risks, to step outside of the lines I had drawn for myself. He had believed in me in a way that no one else ever had, sometimes even more than I had believed in myself. And standing here now, hearing him say those words, it was like facing the version of myself I had walked away from, the version of myself that had once felt so sure of who she was and what she wanted. "Why are you here, Jace?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He was quiet for a long moment, and when I finally looked back at him, his expression was unreadable again, guarded in a way that told me there was more to his presence here than he was ready to admit. "Maybe I just wanted to see if you were still you," he said finally, "or if you had disappeared completely." The words hit me in a place I wasn't ready for, knocking the breath from my lungs. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure if I was still me either. I had spent so long convincing myself that I was happy, that the life I had built was the one I had wanted. But standing here now, with Jace looking at me like he still saw something in me that I had long stopped seeing in myself, I wasn't so sure anymore. "I should go," I said suddenly, the weight of the moment pressing too hard against my chest. Jace didn't move, didn't stop me, but his gaze followed me as I stepped back, as I turned toward the house where Owen would be waiting, where the life I had chosen stood waiting for me to return to it. "Ava," Jace said, and the way he said my name made me pause, just for a second, just long enough for the air between us to feel heavier than before. "You don't have to pretend with me." I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because if I did, I wasn't sure what I would see in his eyes, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. So I kept walking, gripping the camera in my hands, feeling the weight of everything that had just been stirred up inside me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I couldn't ignore, something restless, something unfinished, something that told me that no matter how far I had tried to run from my past, it had finally caught up with me. The distant hum of an engine cut through the quiet, a low rumble that sent a wave of unease crawling up my spine before I even turned to look. I knew that sound too well, knew the way the tires crunched against the gravel driveway, the way the headlights carved long, stretching shadows across the ground. Owen was home. Earlier than expected. My breath hitched, my fingers tightening around the camera I hadn't realized I was still holding, the weight of it pressing into my palm like an anchor. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in place, caught between the barn behind me and the approaching truck, caught between two different versions of myself, two different lives, two different choices. I glanced to the side, my pulse pounding in my ears, and my eyes locked onto Jace, still standing where I had left him. His expression didn't change, but I could see the way his shoulders tensed slightly, the way his hands curled into loose fists at his sides, like he could already feel the shift in the air, the unspoken storm brewing on the horizon. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe, forcing my feet to move as the truck rolled to a stop, the headlights flickering off, leaving behind only the dim light of the barn lantern and the soft glow of the setting sun. The driver's side door swung open, and Owen stepped out, his boots hitting the gravel with a dull thud. He stood there for a second, one hand still on the door, his gaze sweeping over the barn, the fence line, the open stretch of land before finally landing on me. His expression was unreadable, a mask of quiet curiosity, but I knew better than to mistake his silence for indifference. He saw everything. He always had. Still out here? His voice was calm, casual even, but there was something beneath it. Something measured, something sharp enough to make my stomach twist. I lost track of time, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Just needed some air. Owen nodded slowly, his eyes flicking past me, landing on Jace. The shift in his expression was barely noticeable, just the slightest tightening of his jaw, the faintest flicker of something in his gaze, but I caught it. He knew who Jace was, maybe not by name, maybe not entirely by story, but he knew. And even if he didn't, the sight of another man standing here, on our land, with me, would have been enough to make his mind start working, piecing things together in ways that might not even be true, but would still feel like a threat. "Didn't realize we had company," Owen said, his tone even, but carrying an edge that wasn't there before. Jace didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't back down. He just nodded slightly, his voice just as controlled as Owen's when he finally spoke. "Didn't realize I needed an invitation." The air between them stretched tight, thick with something I didn't have the energy to name, and I felt caught between them in a way that made my skin prickle. My fingers curled around the strap of my camera, gripping it like it could somehow ground me, like it could stop the room from spinning even though we weren't in a room at all. "Jace was just leaving," I said quickly, forcing the words out before the silence could deepen into something worse. Jace's eyes flicked to mine, something unreadable passing through them, something that made my stomach twist even tighter, but he didn't argue. He didn't challenge me. He just held my gaze for a second longer, something lingering between us, something unfinished, before he finally nodded and took a step back. "Right," he said, his voice quieter now, almost careful. "I'll see you around, Eva." My breath caught at the sound of my name on his lips, softer than before, gentler, but still carrying the weight of something I wasn't ready to face. He turned and walked off into the growing darkness, his footsteps fading into the distance, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on Owen, forced myself not to watch Jace disappear. Owen was still watching me, still waiting, still putting together the pieces of something he didn't fully understand yet, but was already starting to suspect. "Old friend?" he asked, his tone neutral, but I could hear the unspoken question buried beneath it. I nodded, shifting on my feet, my fingers still wrapped around my camera like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to this moment. "Something like that." The words felt hollow, and I knew he could hear it too. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes searching, peeling back layers I didn't want to expose. And then finally, he let out a breath, stepping closer, reaching out, brushing his fingers along my arm in a way that should have been reassuring, but only made my chest feel heavier. "Come inside," he said, his voice softer now, quieter, like he was offering me a way out of whatever this was. Like he was giving me a chance to pretend that nothing had shifted, that nothing had changed. But it had. I could feel it. I could feel it in the way my heart was still racing, in the way my mind was still replaying the way Jace had looked at me, the way he had spoken to me, the way he had seen me. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I could keep pretending. I wasn't sure if I wanted to. But I nodded anyway, letting Owen take my hand, letting him guide me back toward the house, back toward the life I had built, back toward the version of myself that I had spent so long trying to hold together. Even if, deep down, I knew that cracks were already starting to form, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep them from breaking wide open. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching longer than it should. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing absent patterns against the wood grain, my thoughts spinning in endless circles. The camera rested beside me, its weight a quiet reminder of everything I had been trying to ignore. I hadn't touched it in years, not really, not in the way that mattered. But now, after everything, after Jace showing up, after the look in his eyes that seemed to cut straight through me, after the way Owen's voice had carried something unspoken, something questioning, something almost accusing, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I reached for the camera hesitantly, my fingers brushing against the familiar surface, and the memories came rushing back faster than I could brace for them. The first time I held it in my hands, the first time I realized what it felt like to see the world through a lens, to capture something real, something raw. The way it made me feel weightless and grounded all at once, like I had found something I was meant to do, something that made me feel alive. It had been years since I had felt that way, years since I had let myself miss it. I swallowed hard and lifted the camera, turning it over, running my thumb over the worn edge of the grip. My heart beat a little faster, my breath catching slightly as I brought it up to eye level, looking through the viewfinder. The world narrowed instantly, everything fading away except for what was in focus, what was framed, what was real in that tiny, captured moment. I exhaled slowly, the feeling washing over me like something both foreign and familiar. I had forgotten how much I missed this, how much I missed seeing the world this way, the way a single moment could be frozen in time, held on to, remembered. The way a single photograph could say something I had never been able to put into words. The way it used to make me feel like I had a purpose, like I had something to offer the world beyond the life I had built here, beyond the responsibilities I had let define me. I lowered the camera, blinking as the room came back into focus, as the weight of everything I had buried settled back over me. I glanced toward the window, the dark outline of the barn visible in the distance, the sky above it a deep, endless blue. Moonlight was out there, probably standing quietly in the paddock, his silver coat glowing under the soft shine of the moon. And somewhere beyond that, Jace. I could still hear his voice in my head, the way he had said my name, the way he had looked at me like he was seeing something I wasn't sure existed anymore. You don't have to pretend with me. The words had stuck, burrowing deep, refusing to let go. Because he was right. I had been pretending. For years, I had told myself that this life was enough, that I had made my choice, that the things I had given up were simply things that didn't fit anymore. But standing there with him, hearing the way he spoke about my photography like it was still a part of me, like it hadn't disappeared just because I stopped picking up a camera, had cracked something open inside me. It wasn't gone. It had just been buried. And now, for the first time in a long time, I felt it stirring again, pulling at me, waking up something I had convinced myself I no longer needed. I set the camera down carefully, my hands still tingling from the weight of it, from the memories it carried, from the realization that I wasn't sure if I could keep pushing this part of myself away. I pushed back from the table, suddenly restless, suddenly needing air, needing space, needing something I couldn't quite name. I grabbed my sweater from the chair and stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around me instantly, filling my lungs, clearing my head just enough to make me feel steady again. The barn lights were dim, barely casting a glow over the wooden beams, but I could see movement inside, the soft flicker of a shadow shifting near the stalls. Jace. My pulse quickened before I could stop it, before I could remind myself that I wasn't supposed to feel anything, that I wasn't supposed to let myself wonder what might have been, what could still be. I took a step forward, then another, drawn to the barn before I could think better of it, before I could remind myself that this was dangerous, that this was a line I wasn't sure I could cross. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, the scent of hay and leather filling the air, familiar and comforting. Jace looked up from where he had been leaning against one of the stalls, his eyes catching the dim light, sharp and knowing. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't look like he had expected anything else. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, steady, cutting through the quiet. I shook my head, my fingers tightening slightly around the edges of my sweater. "I guess not." He nodded, watching me for a long moment, his gaze searching, peeling away the layers I had spent so long building up. And for once, I didn't try to stop him. I didn't try to look away. "You picked up your camera," he said, and it wasn't a question. I let out a breath, feeling the weight of those words settle into my chest. "Yeah," I admitted. "I did." He smiled slightly, the corner of his mouth tugging up just enough to make my stomach flip in a way I wasn't ready to deal with. "Good," he said, and there was something in his voice, something warm, something almost proud, something that made me feel like I had just taken the first step toward something I didn't fully understand yet. The silence stretched between us, heavy, but not uncomfortable, filled with all the things we weren't saying, all the things we didn't need to say. And as I stood there, in the quiet hum of the barn, with Jace looking at me like I was still that girl he had known all those years ago, the one who chased the light, who saw the world through a lens of possibility instead of responsibility, I realized something. This feeling, this pull, this spark, it had never really gone out. It had just been waiting for me to notice it again. And now, I wasn't sure if I could ignore it anymore. The house felt different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped together in my lap, my fingers twisting the hem of my sweater as my mind spun in 1,000 different directions. Owen was downstairs, the low hum of his voice carrying through the floorboards as he spoke on the phone, his tone clipped, professional, steady. He sounded the way he always did, like he was in control, like nothing was slipping through the cracks, like everything in his world was exactly as it should be. But I knew better. I knew the moment he walked in earlier tonight, his eyes sharp, his movements a little too precise, that he had already figured out something was wrong. He had always been good at reading between the lines, at picking up on the smallest shifts, and no matter how much I had tried to pretend that nothing had changed, that I was the same as I had always been, I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, unraveling the careful balance I had been holding onto for so long. The truth was, I had never been a good liar, and Owen had never been the kind of person who let things go unanswered. The creak of the stairs made my heart lurch, and I forced myself to breathe evenly, to steady my hands, to school my expression into something neutral as the door pushed open and Owen stepped inside. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, watching me, his eyes scanning my face, my posture, the way my fingers fidgeted with the fabric of my sleeve. The silence stretched between us thick, waiting, until finally he exhaled, closing the door behind him and leaning against it, arms crossed over his chest. "You're different," he said simply, and the way he said it, so certain, so absolute, sent a chill down my spine. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse pounding in my ears. I don't know what you mean. He tilted his head slightly, studying me, and I knew the moment the words left my mouth that he didn't believe them. Ava. Just my name, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between us, of every moment that had led up to this one, of every quiet shift he had noticed but hadn't confronted until now. My fingers tightened in my lap, and I forced myself to meet his gaze, even though I wasn't sure I had the strength to hold it. I don't know what you want me to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He let out a slow breath, pushing off the door and stepping closer, his movements careful, deliberate. I want you to tell me the truth. My chest ached at the softness in his voice, at the way he wasn't angry, not yet, not exactly. He just wanted to understand. He just wanted me to say the thing we had both been avoiding. But the truth wasn't simple. The truth was messy, tangled, impossible to explain in a way that wouldn't hurt him, in a way that wouldn't make everything worse. I don't know how, I admitted, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how fragile. Owen sighed, running a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping in front of me, kneeling so we were at eye level. His fingers brushed against mine, hesitant, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself really look at him, at the man I had built a life with, at the man I had once believed was my safe place, my home. And maybe he still was, in some ways. Maybe that was what made this so hard. Is it him? The question landed like a blow, not because I hadn't expected it, but because hearing it out loud made it real in a way that was impossible to take back. My breath hitched, and I wanted to deny it. Wanted to tell him that it wasn't about Jace, that it was about something bigger, something I had been running from long before he ever showed up again. But the words wouldn't come. Owen's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained steady, searching, waiting. Ava, he said again, and this time, it was different. This time it was a plea. I looked away, my chest tightening, my fingers curling into my palms as I forced the words out. It's not just him, I said quietly. It's me. It's everything. Owen was silent, but I could feel the shift in him, the way his breath slowed, the way his fingers pulled back slightly, as if bracing for something he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. I don't know who I am anymore, I continued, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I don't know how I got here, or when I stopped feeling like myself, but I did. And I've been trying to ignore it, trying to make it okay, trying to be okay, but I'm not. I haven't been for a long time. The admission felt like tearing open a wound, like exposing something raw and vulnerable and broken, and I hated it. Hated how much it hurt. Hated that it was hurting him too. Owen didn't speak right away. He just sat there, watching me, his face unreadable, his hands resting on his knees as if he was grounding himself, as if he was trying to hold himself together the same way I was. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled. Are you saying you want to leave? The question sent a sharp ache through me because I didn't know the answer. I had been avoiding it for so long, running from it, pretending I didn't have to face it. But now, with everything out in the open, I couldn't escape it anymore. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak, because I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to walk away from everything we had built. But I also didn't want to keep living a life that didn't feel like mine. Owen sighed, looking away for a moment, his hands pressing against his knees before he slowly stood, his expression unreadable. I can't fix this for you, he said, and the quiet resignation in his voice nearly shattered me. I can't be the one who makes this choice for you. He turned then, walking toward the door, pausing only briefly before speaking again. But you have to decide, Ava. You can't keep living in the in-between. And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone with the silence, with the weight of the choice I had spent so long trying to avoid. I pressed my hands against my face, my breath coming in uneven gasps, and I knew, deep down, that he was right. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep pretending. The time had come to choose, and no matter which path I took, nothing would ever be the same again.